We have a little bit of time for questions, maybe about 5 minutes, and then depending on whether the technology kicks us out, we can stay beyond that. I don't see any hands yet for questions. Is there anybody who'd like to just jump in? And I think everybody is currently muted, so.
Can you hear me, Liz?
Yeah. Hey, Jim.
Oh, hi. This is Jim Collins. Let me direct a question to Genya. Let me first thank both speakers for some really interesting presentations. Genya, could you say a little bit more about this lack of, on the part of some groups, to see an equivalence between gene drives and synthetic biology? And in particular, I guess it's in the U.S. that this equivalence is not being seen. What's driving that distinction? What's driving the distinction in that gene drives are seen as something different from synthetic biology? If you remember, we had that workshop at MIT and then at Berkeley, and it was creating a research agenda for the ecological implications of synthetic biology, and we talked a fair amount about gene drives in that one. Maybe you could say a little bit more about it.
Sure, thank you. I'm just confirming I'm off mute. You can hear me.
You are.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So it is, I think, a function of how people define synthetic biology and what they put under that umbrella. And there is this point could be debated a lot about whether gene drives are a synthetic biology tool or not. When we in the U.S. take our policy position on biological engineering or synthetic biology, we find that it is easier to talk about biological engineering and a whole range of different tools and technologies that go into making biology easier to engineer faster, smarter, on larger scales. Gene editing technologies are one of those tools. Gene drives are a specific application, and we do not necessarily see gene editing or gene drives as the purview or absolute domain of a synthetic biology community. We instead generally consider biological engineering and a variety of different tools. Now, I understand that from a funding perspective, and I've had conversations with the National Science Foundation about this, it is helpful to bring together multiple disciplines and to capture new developments, new technologies within program areas in synthetic biology, systems biology. A number of different kinds of descriptions are used to bring that together. However, from our point of view, gene drives themselves can be used by a wide range of different individuals or researchers, and not all of them will label themselves as synthetic biologists. I hope that is a little bit helpful in clarifying that.
Okay, that helps some, but I mean, I guess it's clear that the devil's in the details as far as what groups and individuals are characterizing as synthetic biology versus systems biology versus gene drives, et cetera. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments?
So this is Wayne. Do we have time for one more question?
Absolutely. And I think we should just go until the technology kicks us off, which it may not do for a while.
So Cliff, I thought that was a very interesting talk. And the reason I thought it was interesting is that it's really integrated decision making. And some of your slides look very familiar to what I teach and what is a risk assessment approach to that. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really see in your discussion where there was a talk about the similarities between risk assessment as we do for a contaminated site and the technology assessment. But there's so many similarities. I was just wondering if you guys had ever discussed that, like about, you really need to engage local stakeholders. That's a very common thing, any kind of decision making. So that's the first part of the question. The second part is, when I'm doing risk assessment, it's also very important to know what the regulatory decision alternatives are, what kind of regulation you're working on. I don't recall seeing that in your slides or in your discussion. Sometimes that's at a very local level. Sometimes it's constrained by national legislation. I'd like you to address that as well.
Sure. First of all, with regard to risk assessment can be viewed as an important, essential part of a broader technology assessment. Yes, we care about risks, of course. We care about benefits as well, both intended and unintended, direct and indirect. And so, depending upon the assessment topic and how it is scoped, that is what the questions are, what are the impacts or outcomes about which you care, risk assessment can be built into technology assessment that is looking more broadly at other sorts of impacts from different perspectives. So sure, a lot of the techniques probably ought to look similar, and the consumer, patient, citizen engagement should look similar as well. Secondly, with regard to kind of the regulatory context of technology assessment, sure, the technologies that are even assessed or the problems that are assessed are sometimes shaped by or influenced by regulatory parameters. And what you can do as part of a technology assessment is, depending on the circumstances, take the regulatory parameters as givens and say we are operating within that sphere or that space, or you can say, as we examine these technologies and how they may, what the impacts that they may have, we see that some technologies are going to outstrip or render obsolete, potentially, existing regulations, as well as existing ethical standards and so forth. And so oftentimes as part of a technology assessment, we will see that this is going to create a situation that's going to challenge regulations or challenge other standards. And as a result of the assessment, we may want to say these are going to have to be revisited or revised. I mean, everything from birth control to contraception to stem cell research. There's just so many examples, stem cell technology, there's so many examples where new technologies have outstripped regulations and other standards.
Right. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Others?
I have one more question, but I can wait until everyone else gets a chance.
Let's see if anybody else has a question. Go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, and this is for Gina as well. When I was looking at the CSIRO risk assessment, their endpoints were derived by the researchers, not by the stakeholders. So I found that a very interesting way of doing it, especially after Cliff's talk. And I wonder if you have had a chance to look at that report in detail. And it's also a very limited scoped assessment. And so I'm trying to get the technology assessment and that risk assessment to perhaps mesh together, because I know that CSIRO group's assessment is probably going to be used as a model. And I'm trying to think about how these two aspects are going to go together. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
So I will preface this by saying that I was not involved in the scope of that project. So it would be the CSIRO experts who would know what the parameters were within which they were working to conduct that assessment. So I think you would have to ask them that. So they were working within a set of constraints. I have spoken with at least one of the persons involved in that study, and they are aware of the stakeholder engagement concerns And I do not know what the follow-on processes will be from that study.
Okay.
From my training in ecological risk assessment and stakeholder engagement in these processes, it is important to do stakeholder engagement well and early, and I completely agree with the problem formulation comments that were made by Cliff. That is, and this is part of the reason why I am so interested in having our office try to facilitate more collaborations and capacity building with communities who are the target, essentially, of some of these technological solutions to their problems. And also, I agree that in problem formulation, there is a need to consider a wide range of different types of solutions. The technology that you are most interested in may not be the solution that is most acceptable or the most appropriate. So the stakeholder engagement piece of this is critical, and it also depends on what kind of process that you're trying to run. Stakeholder engagement within the technical process of a risk analysis can be very different from stakeholder engagement in something like a problem formulation and options assessment process. So I would say that for the CSIRO study, you would definitely have to ask those who are in charge of that as to how they constructed that. But generally speaking, I am in agreement with Cliff on the utility of doing these things and the absolute need to do such things.
Thanks.
I have a question if nobody else wants to jump in, and this is, Jenya, both for you and Cliff. Cliff and I talked about this a little bit in planning. How long does it take to set up an effective system for such review? Particularly, Jenya, you were talking about your concern for international African countries, which has been a concern of mine, where governance structures are limited and often hobbled by an assortment of resource limitations. How long does it take to set up and do the capacity building for this kind of technology assessment or review? And when we think about the need for prompt response, how possible is that?
Well, you mentioned Jenya first, so I'm waiting for her to answer first unless she wants to toss it over to me.
Look, I mean, I would want to toss that over to you because you have a very specific set of examples that you ran through there. I mean, for me, the only thing I can say on this is completely context dependent, right? It's going to really depend on who your institutions are in country. It's going to depend on, who your collaborator would be, what it is that you want to work on, the type of funding that you have, the motivations of the institution that's working on a technology application, what their staying capacity is, what their funding is. I do not have a blanket answer for that. It's a challenging question, and the reason why I and my office have struggled to find partners who can share best practices from previous types of collaboration around this with those researchers who are very eager to get into this space and to develop new collaborations but may never have been involved in before. Trying to set up maybe an agricultural biotechnology field trial in a specific country. And then there's a lot that can be learned from previous experiences, but there's not going to be one right answer that will fit.
Yeah, it is. I agree that it is context specific. What's worth considering, though, is what is already on the ground that has done, or groups that have done things like this. Are there groups that have done environmental assessments or have a recent experience? Are there HTA groups that have done some things in public health, or at least have a framework or an approach and some resources to do this? can you put together an international network of groups that would get you started, get you moving? I didn't mention the idea of rapid TA or rapid HTA. There are some models for how do you kind of do something quickly, how do you put together an assessment quickly when, let's say, a government policymaker wants an answer in 6 to 8 weeks. So what I would say is give us the idea what the problem is. Can we start to find and put together some capacity from existing organizations and then try to bridge them, whether virtually or otherwise? There is expertise out there that you can tap. It'll take some pretty strong skills and experience and networking skills to piece it together, but it is doable.
Well, thank you. Anyone else? And Keegan, do you have any comments or questions that you'd like to make with regard to wrap-up?
Sure. Well, just to say thank you to all of our speakers for their excellent presentations and bearing with us with these technology glitches. This is the last of the webinar series for the Committee on Gene-Driven Research and Non-Human Organisms. All of the webinar presentations, recordings, if they were available, are available on the website now. So please continue to use those, certainly the committee, but the broader community listening in as a resource. They will be left there. This webinar also was recorded, and the video from it will be put up within the next few days. So thank you again. Any last comments, Liz or Jim?
No,
nope,
just
that's it.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and that concludes our webinar.